Thomas Redfern was the kind of man no one noticed, until the night his fingerprint was found on a £3 million drug shipment that never should have existed. In the heart of Liverpool's glittering city centre, where the lights never go out and the money never stops moving, Redfern's quiet life as an accountant began to unravel, exposing a network so deeply woven into the city's foundations that even the police couldn't tell where business ended and crime began. Liverpool's city centre glitters with a kind of energy that never seems to fade. The music drifts through the streets, spilling from bars and clubs, mixing with the hum of car engines and the laughter of crowds heading home. Tourists take photos by the waterfront, the liverbirds watching silently from their towers above. It looks alive, modern, safe. But underneath the bright lights and polished glass, a darker rhythm plays out, one that the average passerby will never see. The city's reputation as the UK's cultural heart hides a more troubling title: the country's drug crime capital. Official figures show 359 drug-related offences in a single year, the highest anywhere in England and Wales. To most, that's just a number, another headline that fades in a day, but behind it are stories of addiction, power, and quiet corruption, spreading through the streets like smoke. The heart of Liverpool beats fast, but some say it's beating for the wrong reasons. Police patrols move in circles around the city centre, targeting hotspots where deals are known to happen. Yet every raid feels like cutting the head off a snake that simply grows back. Dealers vanish before they're caught, warehouses are emptied overnight, and phones used for transactions go dead minutes after calls are traced. It's a game of shadows, and the city's criminals have learned how to blend in perfectly. What makes Liverpool's situation different is how deeply the trade has sunk into everyday life. The gangs don't just work in the back alleys or derelict estates. They've moved into student flats, short-term holiday rentals, and city centre apartments that were once part of regeneration schemes. Ordinary buildings have become their command posts. From the outside they look like any other home, but inside they hold stockpiles of pills, powder, and cash, ready to move at a moment's notice. Taxi drivers, delivery riders, and even cleaners unknowingly become part of the chain. Packages are dropped off under innocent pretenses, exchanged for small payments that no one questions. To an outsider, it's just the normal rush of a city that never slows down. To those on the inside, it's an entire system designed to stay hidden in plain sight. The police know this, but knowing is different from proving. Each corner of Liverpool's city centre has its own unspoken rules. Some streets are considered neutral ground. Others belong to certain crews who run them like miniature kingdoms. Rival groups avoid open conflict. It attracts too much attention, but their competition is constant. A shipment missed, a deal gone wrong, and an entire chain can collapse. That's why trust is rare and betrayal is expensive. Those who talk don't stay around for long. For residents living among it all, the sense of unease never quite goes away. They see things that don't add up. Cars idling at odd hours, strange visitors in and out of the same flat, the flicker of lights in abandoned buildings. Some report it, most stay quiet. In a place where the police struggle to keep up, silence often feels safer. The authorities describe it as an entrenched problem, a network that has taken root so firmly that removing it could tear parts of the city apart. Every year brings new initiatives, more funding, and stronger technology. Yet the results are temporary. The gangs adapt faster than the systems meant to stop them. For every dealer arrested, another fills the gap before the paperwork is finished. Beneath the nightlife and the tourist smiles, Liverpool's heart hides a constant pulse of fear and profit. It's not loud, not obvious, but it's there, echoing through the clubs, the cafes and the corridors of luxury apartments. The city's regeneration projects, once symbols of hope, now stand as silent witnesses to a hidden empire built on addiction and desperation. No one can say exactly when the shift began, when the line between normal city life and organized crime blurred beyond recognition. But one thing is certain. The trade is no longer happening in the shadows. It's right there in the center, operating behind locked doors and polite smiles, feeding off the same energy that keeps the city alive. Liverpool has become a place where beauty and danger exist, side by side, where every bright light casts a darker shadow, and where the true heartbeat, the city, might not come from its music, but from the quiet hum of a business that never stopped. The name most whispered among officers and criminals alike was the network. No one could say who founded it, who led it, or even how many people were involved. It existed like a rumor that kept proving itself true. Police intelligence files were filled fragments, bits of surveillance footage, intercepted messages, unexplained money transfers, but none of it pointed to a face or a single figure of authority. The network wasn't a gang in the traditional sense. It was an invisible web that stretched through every part of Liverpool's city centre, pulling people in without them even realizing. It began quietly, through the rise of encrypted phones and messaging apps that promised total anonymity. Street dealers who once relied on word of mouth now worked through secret codes, sent across apps that deleted messages seconds after they were read. The communication was clean, untraceable, and fast. Orders were placed like takeaway meals. A location would appear, the drop would happen, and the goods would vanish into the city's bloodstream. It was business without faces, crime without names. The network grew by exploiting the very systems meant to protect modern life. Delivery companies, online rental platforms, and cashless payment services became tools for concealment. A small flat, listed for short-term let, could be used for a week to store product and then wiped clean of all evidence. Rented vehicles would appear, make deliveries, and disappear before the registration could be traced. Even local student communities were unknowingly drawn in, recruited as couriers under the promise of easy cash. They were told they were delivering parcels, never asking what was inside. When police analysts tried to connect the dots, the picture refused to form. Each lead led to another dead-end. Shell companies registered abroad. Fake passports, encrypted hard drives that self-erased before investigators could crack them. The more they searched, the more it seemed that the network didn't exist as a single entity at all, but as a structure built from many small, replaceable parts. Every member could vanish without affecting the whole. It was like chasing smoke through the city's alleys. For months, detectives poured through thousands of hours of CCTV footage. They watched the same faces cross the same streets, always carrying something but never the same thing twice. They watched couriers meet under the glow of streetlights, exchange small items, then split off in opposite directions. None of them fit the profile of hardened criminals. Most looked ordinary: students, shop workers, people blending into the rhythm of city life. That was the network's greatest strength. It didn't need loyalty, it needed invisibility. Rumors spread through the underground that the group was controlled by someone who never lived in Liverpool. Someone who directed operations from another city or even another country. But others said the opposite, that the real leaders lived right there in the heart of the city, posing as businessmen, charity workers, even property developers. The uncertainty kept everyone guessing. Fear worked better than violence. The network never had to threaten people openly. Its reputation was enough. Then came the first break in months. A packet of drugs was found discarded behind a nightclub near the Rope Walks district. It wasn't unusual, leftovers from a deal gone wrong, but when it was logged and tested, forensic officers found something strange. Hidden inside the wrapping was a partial fingerprint, clear enough for identification but not matching anyone in the existing criminal database. The print belonged to a man who had never been on the police radar. That small discovery shifted everything. The case, once abstract and digital, suddenly had a human connection. The print was traced to Thomas Redfern, an accountant employed at a local housing charity. He had no criminal record, no history of debt, and no links to any known offenders. His life appeared spotless, the sort of person who filed tax returns on time and kept receipts for everything. Yet his fingerprint had turned up on a package that was meant to vanish without a trace. Detectives couldn't explain how someone like him could be involved, but as they dug into his background, new questions began to surface. Redfern's job gave him access to large amounts of money tied to city center properties. He managed funds for housing developments and grant applications, all of which moved through his hands before reaching their destinations. On paper, everything balanced perfectly, but the timing of his transactions, the transfers, and the movements of money began to line up with known drug shipments across the city. The network had always been invisible, but now it seemed to have a face, and not the kind anyone expected. The discovery of a single fingerprint on a discarded packet hinted that the operation was more sophisticated, more deeply rooted, and far closer to legitimate power than anyone had ever imagined. The police had spent years looking in alleyways and nightclubs for the source. They were about to learn that the real mastermind might be sitting behind a desk in a city center office, wearing a suit and balancing the books for a crime empire hiding in plain sight. Thomas Redfern was the last person anyone expected to find linked to organized crime. 32 years old, quiet, punctual, and politely invisible. He lived in a modest flat near Duke Street and walked to work every morning carrying the same gray briefcase. He had spent most of his adult life working for a housing charity dedicated to helping low-income families find affordable homes in the city center. His reputation was spotless, his manners understated, and his life almost painfully ordinary. Yet when his fingerprint turned up on that discarded activity, he didn't seem afraid. His pulse never changed, his voice remained steady, and his only reaction came when he was told about the fingerprint. A flicker of something, relief, maybe recognition, crossed his face, and then it was gone. To the detectives, it felt as if he had expected to be caught. After hours of silence, the interview ended without confession or clue. Redfern was charged with fraud and conspiracy, but the most important answers were still missing. Who was he working for? Who controlled the money? And what would happen on the 19th at the river? As the clock ticked toward that date, investigators began to realize that Redfern wasn't the end of the trail but the beginning of something much larger. The coded notebook wasn't just evidence, it was an invitation. Someone wanted them to look, but only so far. Liverpool's quiet accountant had built an empire hidden behind charity paperwork and housing projects, but even he wasn't the top. The network had chosen him carefully, a man invisible to suspicion, whose good reputation was the perfect disguise. What no one knew yet was that the red-marked date in his notebook wasn't simply a meeting. It was a trap set in motion long before his arrest. One that would pull the investigation deeper into the dark machinery running beneath Liverpool's glittering streets. The night of the 19th arrived cold and windless, the River Mersey dark and still beneath the lights of the city. Detectives watched from unmarked cars positioned along the waterfront, their radios whispering coded updates. They had studied Redfern's notebook for days, tracing every figure and coordinate, and everything pointed to the same place, a narrow stretch of dockland near the pier head. At 11:45 p.m., the time marked in red, the water shifted slightly under the glare of a single security lamp. Through the mist, a small boat approached with its lights off, gliding soundlessly toward the shore. Two figures were on board, one steering, the other crouched near several black duffel bags. They moved with precision, as if they had done this dozens of times before. The police held their positions, waiting for the moment to strike. When the boat reached the dock, the men began unloading the bags, placing them carefully beside an old tunnel entrance once used for maintenance work. The exchange was swift, no words, no hesitation. Then, as one man turned to leave, a sound echoed through the still air, the faint crunch of gravel beneath a boot. The man looked up. For a second, everything froze. Then chaos erupted. The suspect bolted toward the tunnel while the other stumbled, dropping one of the bags. Officers moved in, shouting commands that were drowned out by the roar of engines as backup vehicles closed off the exits. Within minutes, one suspect lay unconscious on the ground, struck by a stun device during the chase. The second man had disappeared into the tunnel, vanishing into the maze beneath the city. When the duffel bags were opened, the officers stared in disbelief. Inside were bricks of high-purity cocaine, neatly packed and stamped with identical red crown symbols. The estimated street value was over £3 million. But there was something else. An envelope sealed with red wax. Inside was a single photograph of the Liver building, taken from across the water, and a handwritten message. The city feeds itself. The meaning of the message wasn't immediately clear. Some believed it was a taunt, others thought it was a warning. But as investigators traced the drug's origin, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The supply wasn't being imported as assumed, instead it was being recycled within the city. Drugs seized in smaller operations were somehow making their way back into circulation, repackaged and resold. The network wasn't just distributing drugs, it was controlling every stage of the trade from recovery to redistribution. Weeks of analysis revealed links between police evidence stores, private security contractors, and transport firms connected to old regeneration projects. The same projects Redfern's charity had helped finance. The drugs were moving through legitimate systems, camouflaged by paperwork and routine. Even the tunnels beneath the docks, long thought abandoned, had been repurposed as storage and transport routes. The city itself was part of the operation, every building and system unknowingly supporting the trade. The unconscious suspect eventually regained consciousness, but his identity raised more questions than answers. He wasn't a known criminal. His background was clean, his employment history tied to a logistics company that handled municipal waste. He refused to speak, and when officers traced his employer, they found it registered to one of Redfern's shell companies. The circle was closing, but the faces behind it remained hidden. Rumors began circulating among officers that the network's reach went higher than anyone dared admit. Some whispered that certain financial institutions were benefiting from the constant movement of cash through laundering schemes. Others believed property developers and city officials were being used as unknowing fronts. The message in the envelope, "The city feeds itself," sounded less like a taunt and more like a statement of fact. By the end of the operation, one truth was clear. Liverpool Centre wasn't merely the stage for the drug trade, it was the machine powering it. Every transaction, every construction deal, every property sale was a cog in a larger system that generated both wealth and ruin in equal measure. Redfern's coded message had led them to a shipment, but not to the source. The man who escaped that night was never found, and surveillance of the tunnels was later abandoned after multiple failed attempts to navigate their flooded lower levels. Back in custody, Redfern remained silent, offering no explanation for the river exchange or the message's meaning. But those who worked the case began to understand. The network wasn't hiding in the shadows of Liverpool, it was the shadow itself, stretching across the city's skyline, shaping its growth and decay alike. The drugs, the money, the buildings, even the police raids, were all part of a system that had learned to survive by feeding on its own failures. And somewhere beneath the surface, the one who orchestrated it all was still out there, watching as the city unknowingly kept his empire alive. Thomas Redfern's death came without warning. 3 weeks after the river operation, prison guards found him motionless in his cell during morning rounds. The report listed suicide as the cause, a neat conclusion for a case that had become too tangled to control. Yet those who had spoken to him only hours before said he showed no signs of despair. His voice had been calm, his eyes clear, and he had eaten breakfast as usual. The only thing unusual was that the security camera covering his corridor had gone offline for 13 minutes during the night. When it came back on, Redfern was already gone. The official investigation was brief. No foul play could be proven, and his death was filed away with quiet efficiency. For the detectives who had followed his trail from the nightclub to the river, it felt like the air had been pulled out of the case. Without Redfern, the coded notebook led nowhere. The companies he managed dissolved overnight, their records erased, their offices emptied. The network had once again vanished, leaving behind only the faint outline of its existence. Months passed, the city centre appeared calmer. Drug arrests fell, and local papers ran cautious headlines, suggesting that Liverpool's darkest chapter might be closing. But those living close to the docks noticed that the nights grew strangely busy again. Vans came and went at hours when the streets should have been silent. New businesses opened in the same locations that had once served as drop points. Even the empty flats that police had raided months before were quietly refurbished and rented out to new tenants no one could identify. Then came the first twist. A new housing development was announced along the waterfront. A series of luxury apartments built by a company called Mercy Horizon Developments. The name meant nothing to most, but to those still watching the case, it stood out. The company had been incorporated only a week after Redfern's death, registered to an address previously used by one of his fake charities. Its financial director was listed as E. Redfern. The first initial could have been coincidence, but the surname hit like an echo. Investigators dug through the paperwork. The new Redfern had no birth record, no national insurance number, and no tax history before that year. The identity was manufactured, complete down to a digital footprint of fake social media accounts. Whoever created it had done so with precision. The directors of the company were ghosts too, names borrowed from dead citizens and foreigners who would never know. Yet the company's funding was real, its investors legitimate, and its projects approved by the city council. The network hadn't disappeared. It had evolved into something more sophisticated, something entirely legal on the surface. When journalists began asking questions about the development's backers, they were met with silence. One reporter received an anonymous email warning her to let the city breathe. Another disappeared her article before it was published. The file deleted from the newsroom's database. The deeper anyone looked, the faster the trail turned cold. It became clear that the network no longer needed to hide underground. It was now operating through contracts, tenders, and planning permissions. What once moved through tunnels and nightclubs now flowed through boardrooms and construction sites.